Anyway, so our next talk is going to be from Wöden Kusner from Lawrence University, and he's going to talk about Gordian Unlinks.
Yeah, so let's see. I've changed the title back and forth about this. I think it's building Gordian links. We probably won't get to Gordian unlinks in this amount of time, but if you're curious about it, you can ask me offline or a little bit later. Let's see. So thankfully, Rob has introduced rope. That's going to be our setting as well, and he's sort of at least gotten to the notion of Gordian. Right. So let's see. I want to just tell you more of a story. We won't get into too much depth here. And we'll start with, maybe this idea of going back at least to Alexander, and then sort of reinvigorated as knots became kind of more of interest. So, here we don't have rope. Here we just have, say, a representation of some knot. And this looks very complicated, right? I think this was created possibly by just tangling something up and dropping it on the table and then drawing this crossing diagram here. And perhaps it's a challenge to, everyone to say, okay, so is this a knot in the mathematical sense, or is this an unknot? Is this actually just a circle? Right? So you can hint Gordian unknot. So can you see it? In fact, this one's kind of fun because there's a lot of these just overcrossings here. So you can almost see that someone maybe, took a piece of string, kind of crumbled it up, dropped it down, and then there's this big cluster here that's underneath everything else. But just looking at it, maybe this, right, you just couldn't tell me if I gave you this offhand, okay, this is an unknot without quite a lot of work. So let's see. Here are some maybe simpler examples. Again, if I gave you a piece of string, in principle, you could make these, or if I gave you these, in principle, you could untangle them. But I think these are some examples that were constructed, both in collaboration with Kaufman, that are examples where you have to do some unintuitive stuff, like maybe increasing a crossing number or working kind of hard to untangle these and lay these out into a nice circle. Right. So again, this is just for these kind of idealized knots. So oops. So if you're doing the mathematics, the question is, well, can you always untangle these such things just topologically? And there's sort of the conjecture and the big theorem can be restated. Hatcher's theorem now basically says that, yes, you can do this. There's maybe not, that these all actually are unknotted, and you can topologically deform these in some nice way to get just a round circle, right? These live in the same connected component for the space of circles, right? So here, you can always unknot even some family of topological unknots, right? If I give you a bunch of stuff kind of mixed together, topologically, you can always pull it apart, separate it, make them round. Okay. So what this means is there's really no topological obstruction to finding some nice flow, right? This would be, the dream, right? I give you this kind of stuff, right? And, you wave your magic wand and put a potential on it, or, you do some procedure that's, natural, and it, just kind of unknots itself, right? We don't have to do this. We don't have to go in, cut things up, rearrange things. You just do this and kind of unrolls itself.
That's the early version of localized boundary.
Yeah. Yes. This is Alexander. So there are a couple candidates for this that live in the background here. I think Rob also kind of mentioned this, at least in this idea of thickening or curvature flow. There's sort of a curve shortening flow in the plane that does beautiful things, right? Actually, this just works. You get some weird kind of nice smooth disk, smooth boundary of a disk. You can flow by shortening the curve, and you'll get some little vanishing, rescaling round circle. Okay, you might think that works in space, right? So what is the analogy of that? It's sort of this thickening or rope shortening flow, right? And there's some experiments that go back a while. All right, so this is indeed an unknot, right? Just kind of tied these two handles in it, and we can use some approximation of curve shortening flow, and this thing kind of pulls itself and undoes itself here. And well, you can kind of do more complicated stuff. I think this is not actually one of these steps, but if you take something similar here and you rack these handles over the top, okay, well, maybe, right? I mean, just from a picture, maybe you get stuck, right? You sort of fatten things up, or you try to shorten this piece of rope. It has some thickness, and you get these. I mean, they're not sort of these cufflink knots, but they seem to be very much like it. Right? You could think these handles get stuck here. Or, maybe you have the other opinion, you say, well, as you shorten this kind of thing just pops off, right? And that would be the dream. These fall off, and you actually then wind back through yourself, and you come to a little round circle. So, this is kind of the question, right? Can you do this? And it's not entirely clear if you can. So, let's go back. We have this definition here. We have rope. Let's ignore sort of the parenthetical stuff here, right? The C11 we saw earlier, et cetera, et cetera. We just have some core curve. We have some scaled thickness to it. Okay. I think we're in the wrong player here. So these, well, we get to use our imagination, right? So this is a core curve. This thickens up, and it becomes this kind of, donut Bialy, sweep out of a disc. And you thicken these up, we get this kind of fat link here. Okay, and there's sort of a point which, Rob mentioned this is a sweep out by a disc. From my point of view, it's going to be useful to think about this as a sweep out by a unit ball. Okay, these two things are actually equivalent. It's, not 100% clear, but if you have a piece of rope, idealized rope, you can actually roll a marble through it, and it's just like a little, one of these toys, right? It just rolls right through.
They would be different if they were ends.
Okay, yes. So here, usually closed curves. So I'm thinking about closed curves, although we'll immediately, throw out that condition just for some thought experiment. Right? Okay. So we've had this kind of topological issue, right? We were thinking about, we have these nasty piles of just topological rope, these curves. Equivalence is by isotopy in space, right? That's our entangling procedure. And of course, for rope, there's this physical analogy. We want to be untangling things, but we want to preserve the fact that it's actually thick rope, right? So when we're doing this unknotting procedure, we want to make sure that the curve never gets too close to itself, right? If we're just doing the core curve, or that we're actually just handling this physical, material thing, we have to untie it without squishing it, squishing the core curve too close to itself. So that's what we have here, right? Physical isotopy is just preserving this length, and it's preserving the injectivity radius, right? It's preserving the thickness. Using this, right, we can try to make this distinction between our topological picture, where we claim, right, basically everything is connected, right, and maybe we descend all the way down. And we can think about this idea of being Gordian, right? So if we have a pair of configurations, right, so maybe two unknots or two different knots of the same type that topologically would be equivalent, but there's no physical isotopy that takes these two things together, right? So two different ropes, right? We can bring them topologically, the core curves are equivalent, but there's no way to move through space, right, with an actual physical piece. So preserving this thickness throughout this isotope. So this is the question. So this is the Gordian question. And we'll have this comment, right? So actually any knot, if you want to compare it to like an unknot, might be Gordian because there's no way to transform a knotted closed curve into a closed curve topologically. Certainly there's no physical way to do that through moves that preserve this thickness and length. But so the relevant question is there a Gordian unknot, a Gordian split link, a Gordian something, right? So in that case, if we go sort of all the way back, right? So this guy, right? Here's a candidate that comes up maybe computationally. If we tighten this all the way down, right? Is there a way that we can actually move, untie this, right? Untie this and get a nice round circle from this tight configuration. Does this sort of match maybe with our intuition for what a Gordian knot should be, right? Something that we have to cut to untie, right? Or we would have to cut this and rearrange it and then glue it back together to see, to put it in the configuration, to an equivalent configuration. Okay, so we'll move to the first thought experiment, right? Is there some Gordian strand? So rather than having a closed curve, just let's think about the image of an interval now, right? This is kind of the first place to start. Can I just take a piece of string, and squish it together into some kind of horrible lump, and then maybe soak it in some water that makes it expand, and then create a ball that you could never untie, right? You'd just be stuck in that configuration. All right. And it seems reasonable. It seems kind of relevant to a lot of the questions in different areas that are coming up today. But I'll let you kind of match your own pattern, right? What your story is. Although there are a couple of different ones that might be relevant. The thought experiment, I'll say just no. The punchline, I believe, we can see is no. And one way, at least in a simple case, is if you've got this free end, right? If I want to untie a knot, actually, if it's made of rope, I can just pull on this end and the whole thing will slide out of itself. I used to call this reptation, but the polymer scientists told me that this is not actually reptation because reptation is it's a whole more complicated thing. I will shift to ecdysis. This is the snake slithering out of its skin. Okay, you shed the skin. And you can kind of see this. If you have a marble, right, the marble can roll through the tube. If you have a free end, well, actually the whole tube can move through the tube. So if you ever want to untie a complicated knot, that you have a free end on, you can take my advice and just pull on it. And yes, no, there's no friction. Yeah, and just pull on it. And if you do it just right, it will unwind itself, just come out into this straight line. What if there isn't a free end, right? I mean, I've given you a procedure there. Okay, well, I claim you can kind of cook up another way to do this procedure. Well, you can just kind of explode it. Right? You take your knot and just blow it up. The same thing kind of should happen. Okay. What if we have this cluster, right? So I take a bunch of more string, right? A whole bunch of strands, right? Again, this is this polymer clusters, right? Also, the same thing can work. And it came to mind even just last week that there's maybe an interesting example of this. Okay, so this was the pulling out of the strand. So this from this spring. So these are California blackworms, which look a lot like sort of weird polymer clustering things, or they look like clusters of rope. They tie themselves up into a ball, but more interestingly, if you disturb them, they just kind of explode and untie themselves. So there's some good videos of this, which again, we can go watch on, a phone somewhere at tea or later. It's really quite cool.
The whole collection.
The whole collection explodes, right? There's a whole bunch of theory for this, right? Like that they built up, but what really happens is they spread apart, right? And this is very quick, right? They take a long time to tie themselves up. You startle them, and they just dissipate. It's
terrifying.
Yes. Yes.
A worm bomb.
Exactly. This is a worm bomb, right? And it ticks, tighter and tighter, and just falls apart.
Right.
Okay. So there's actually, so there's a whole, industry now, I guess, of trying to understand this kind of thing, modeling it. The tightening, I think there's a lot of interesting analysis of the motion here. They do these ultrasound studies of these clusters of worms. They have a theory for why they explode too, but I think there's a 0th approximation of this, which really is this, rope packing principle. If you just, everything, heats up, right? It melts, flies apart when this tube gets larger and larger. All right, so those are for strands, right? There's something going on there that's kind of, as you rescale, things get shorter, right? The picture of these strands, the length gets shorter relative to thickness. You can kind of imagine that, okay, everything's kind of straightens out, everything unties itself. So obviously this trick doesn't work. We have to do, a little more. And the existence of this Gordian Unknot is still completely open, right? This is probably quite a hard problem. A Gordian split link. This is maybe the third best thing or the next best thing. This has been exhibited, a little while ago by Coward and Haas, and it probably looks, I don't know, maybe like what you would cook up if you were trying to come up with a split link and you thought about it for a little while. It's this picture, right? So this is a tight little sort of piece of chain wrapped around the middle, and there are these two just trefoil knots on either end, and you can think, okay, yeah, it's hard to pull a knot through, a hole. So if I put a knot on both sides of a hole, then this should be hard to split, right? And so so what is the other configuration? It's if you just take this little piece of this link here, and you separate these things out. So topologically, you can certainly pull this knot through, move the orange thing over here, the blue thing over here, it's split. And it turns out you can't physically split this. You can't move these two apart while maintaining thickness.
That's not a rope length minimizer.
This is not a rope length minimizer. You could, of course, minimize this orange length and get something, much tighter. Actually, it's sort of an interesting feature of this that it doesn't have to be a rope length minimizer, right? You can loosen the blue one a little bit. You can loosen the orange one as much as you like, and you will not be able to split this link, right? So actually, unlike sort of the minimizing cases, this is potentially useful, right? You can actually make things like this. You'll notice that both this picture from Peransky, right, this kind of cup link knot, and this other one from Mike Friedman and co-authors, this is from one of their kind of electrostatics papers, right? This looks pretty similar to this, right? I mean, it's basically the same thing, except that I've doubled it up and I've made this little loop here. Maybe these things are now against the blue bit. The problem there is that in this one, right, I can kind of fix this length and it's not really interacting with the rest of the orange curve. In this one, as I try to tighten things up, maybe, who knows, maybe things fall off. There's this little kind of, right, this little clasp here can open up and who knows what happens. So two different things, two different pictures. done, completely unclear, but this is a great example. It says, yes, okay. So it says that we have some distinction between the topological theory and the physical theory, right? This gives us some hope that, right, a Gordian unknot, a Gordian link might exist. Okay. So what have we worked on? Maybe the first thing is a toy model. This is kind of one of a series of different things that, you know, we could play with. This is probably the first result from Aspen, you know, that it's been floating around for a little while. And it's the idea of a stopper knot, right? So a knot that you can't pass through an orifice, some fixed orifice. That's sort of essentially what's going on here as well, right? We have this trefoil, it can't pass through this fixed orifice, this surface maybe that you could imagine inside this little link. So you can ignore this.
Do they work if you come out of display mode? Is that works?
Oh, I'm not sure. They're not particularly important, I think. You know, right, we have imaginations for these, and I can show you more animations if you like. So basically, if an aperture, right, so this hole that we're trying to pass something through is too small, then obviously we can't pass any rope through it at all, right? If it's less than sort of the diameter of this ball, or the area of this ball that we fit inside the rope, then you can't pass it through. So we have to have sufficient area to have a unit radius ball, you know, go through this, right? We need at least, you know, a little round hole here, and you can imagine we actually need much more, right? But just, right, what the mathematical obstruction is, the core curve has to touch this aperture, so there has to be a ball that fits inside this tube that also passes through. Okay, so we go through some technical details. You know, we can give ourselves some definitions to make ourselves, you know, satisfied with what it means to pass through an aperture, you know, and how to actually track how the rope, how the stopper knot that we're trying to push through this hole interacts with that, with some surface on there. Okay, we can actually build, well, we can build some links, right? Some configurations of links that we can make arbitrarily difficult to pass through any particular area. What I mean by arbitrarily difficult, I mean is actually just too large. Right? So basically, every time a piece of rope is passing through, it has to trace a little sphere. Right? If you have a piece of rope, it's actually in this aperture, right? There's a little ball on there. So if I can force there to be n pieces of rope in there, I know I have to have an aperture that can contain n discs. Yeah. And there's a nice way to do that. Let's see. Oops. Essentially here, right? If we take an n torus link, as soon as this, say, blue curve is pulled through, right? Let's imagine we're just pulling this through. We can track when this blue curve starts moving to the other side of our surface there, and everything else is linked with it. So actually it drags all the other pieces into that surface. So if we've got n components here, right, we have to have n discs on this surface here. Yeah, so if we can pass it through, this must be sufficiently large. So maybe the converse is, if this little green, if this little green piece here, or this little aperture is too small, this will never pass through. Why would we care about this, right? I mean, stoppers are actually kind of important. You know, don't do this. Yeah, if you're climbing, this slides off the end by our previous argument, right? And actually, if you're a climber, you probably know that this is a very poor choice for a stopper knot in general. You should at least try to take advantage of friction or something a little more. But I guess if you really want to do this right, you should do what maybe some of these other things do. You know, try to link into some, you know, big complicated link instead. Okay, so one of these. Place to stop.
It would be a good sign.
That's great, thanks, right?
And I guess this at the beginning,
Yes.
it's probably not as simple answer, but so this is all defined with respect to thickening or length.
So we actually get to kind of, we don't have to worry too much about thickening, right? We get to fix or let length. So yes, everything is rope, but we can just fix a thickness, right? So we're not so worried about the injectivity radius, you know, kind of changing as we deform the rope.
That's rigid from.
Yeah. I think you have a piece of actual rope, but no friction, no torsion, no twist showing up. Yeah.
So you gave the examples of one thing we can prove and one thing we can't, right? You said, I don't know of an example, provable example of the Gordian unknot. You
Yes.
do have a Gordian link, but the Gordian link was one unknot with one knot.
Yes.
Is it obvious or that you can't, there's no point in studying an unknot and a simple stopper?
So, okay, so you're asking the right question. Let's see. You know, if I had a long time, well, okay,
Do you have a backup on this one?
so this is a unlink.
This is what I'm talking about.
Yes, so this is two unknots.
Can you undo it? Yeah.
Can you undo it? I will tell you no, but it's not written down. But yeah.
Not written as a paper, but you have the proof.
I'm confident. I think I've spoken about. I'm confident. Yes. I think a physicist.
I don't know.
Yeah.
It's gonna be his theory.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I know how to show this.
Okay, so this is provable.
Yeah, and you know, if you're a physicist, you can even probably play around with
And
this.
you will prove that it's impossible.
Yeah. So this should be Gordian. So something like this should be Gordian.
It's Gordian in the sense of no length trading. You can't trade length for one.
Yeah, so this is a distinction. So all of the criticality theory that Rob was talking about requires that you're able to kind of, it's relevant to total length of a link.
Right.
Okay, so this is in some sense more constrained, but the criticality theory doesn't quite work the same way. So in fact, I think it doesn't.
It sort of does work the same. Just that if you're going to use this as a guide to understanding the single component unknot,
Yes.
and you want to pretend these are just distantly connected somehow. You know, you really want to allow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's sort of that's really the big issue maybe with the analogy in this picture, right? Here, I get to just kind of let this do its own thing. Here, this is actually part of the other one, so
Yeah, so you can trade.
so who knows what's going on?
So the tower pots example is sort of cheap because they don't allow length. They're not explicit. They don't have them there. It's not even clear that if you traded they're perfectly colors there, right? So you traded some gold for the blue, maybe the blue could get larger and eventually just slip off. And even in the tight configuration, if you have a tight configuration,
Yeah.
blue length fixed.
So again, the analogy in this case, right?
Right. You can't get something.
Yeah. It's just that they don't treat that case. That's all.
Right, so one last quick one.
Okay.
Yeah, just maybe a follow up and we can talk more about this.
Mhm.
I'm interested to know what you can say about whether the constraints, sort of obstruction is kind of mostly sort of non-local contact, or would you like sort of struts,
In which, so the obstruction in,
local curvature.
so the obstruction in maybe the case that I'm claiming, but
Yeah.
so the very end.
Yeah.
So
Are there examples where it's of one type or another?
Yeah,
What
so-
the what's the structure?
Yeah, we can, that's definitely something that we can try to like at least track down, because I think there's a bunch of different things going on there. All right. Thank you.